So, I just quit my job. Obviously, this is a huge deal for me, but we're gonna get into that story in a second here. What I'm actually doing today is I'm trying to build a truck rack, and I'm building this to help somebody get set up because they could really use the help. So the person I'm building this truck rack for, they've got this nice little Ford Ranger they've had, I think it's a 2007 or so, and after packing enough random stuff kind of across the roof, scratching the paint up and all that over the years, I have finally said enough is enough. Let's get this truck set up with a badass rack so stuff can be moved around in this truck easy as pie. Okay, so for the truck rack, let's check out the plans here. The material I'm gonna be working with is basic square stock. I've got some basic 1.5 by 1.5 square tubing, as well as some rectangular tubing. So combining the square stock with the rectangular tubing, we're gonna make this thing look pretty sick. So I've got this cool idea in my head. We typically see this type of material used to make all kinds of racks similar to this, but I wanna put a different spin on it. So what I'm thinking I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this square tubing and I'm gonna give it a little bit of a turn. Like I said, I'm gonna give it a little bit of a twist. Now instead of square tubing, we have diamond tubing. Sounds somewhat hilarious. Let's take a look at how this actually looks. We're gonna have areas where obviously the joints are gonna meet up like this now. And quite obviously, that's not gonna work. I have welded some pretty severe gaps in my days, but how about we do this instead? I've made myself some little stabilizers, so the square tubing can now be tipped up on its end. And now, once it's secure, I can run it through a bandsaw and cope the ends like this. When I'm cutting it, it's not gonna flip over on the table and crush my fingers. And following some lines I've laid out very carefully, these are gonna come out perfect. Obviously, I really had to do my math with this one to make sure that they fit the overall dimensions I needed, but when I'm finished cutting these ones, they turn out really, really good. So see how when we put them together, the joints look way different now? So on something you've seen probably 1,000 times before. To me personally, I'll be able to spot this out in a parking lot filled with 1 million of these things. Okay, so now I'm tacking this thing together, and I've got to make sure I take the time to do it properly. As you can see, I've got a bit of a makeshift table to work with here. It's not an actual welding table, but I've got it pretty much leveled. It's pretty darn close to being flat. So as I'm tacking this together, I just have to make sure that I check my dimensions, make sure I keep everything flat as I go. I talk about this on my channel all the time, about how important tacking is to putting a project like this together. I want to make sure that every tack is a perfect size, obviously, but what's more important is the placement of each tack. I want each tack to be placed exactly on the start stops so I don't have anything to go over with the actual weld pass later. I want to make sure every tack is the perfect size, nothing too big, so again, it doesn't look stupid when I go over it later with a full pass. So yeah, that quick thing I mentioned about quitting my job, yikes. For everybody who watches my channel, they probably know already, I've been working at the same shop for almost 2 decades now. Told you it was a big deal I was quitting. I started out originally sweeping the floors there and scrubbing the toilets. No joke. I worked my way up all the way from the bottom to being in full production, specializing in TIG, but also doing a ton of wire feed and fabrication. I eventually hit a bit of a plateau where I was getting quite bored with things. Eventually I decided I wanted to go back to school. I did a bunch of certification for other tickets in welding, and I eventually went back for my certification as a welding supervisor. Doing all that stuff in school was a beast for me. I've never personally been a big fan of school, and I've never really done well at school before. However, this is something that would make me a better worker and a better welder, so I was super motivated and I actually did really well in school. And after going to school for it, I started to actually understand the processes of welding and fabrication I'd been doing for years even better. So time well spent in school. Now I have talked about this on my channel before, but I definitely feel like I reached another plateau after doing another few years as welding supervisor. This is actually the area that eventually led me to starting my YouTube channel. I found I wasn't getting the opportunity to train welders quite as often, and at that point I was really missing teaching. Anytime I found myself getting a little bit bored with what I was doing something where I could teach or help people always helped to get me out of this rut. It's something I've always truly connected with. I've always been a pretty decent welder for the most part, with a lot of practice of course, but I do consider myself to have a certain knack with communicating with people and showing motivated people how to get into this trade that I love so much. So this is how my YouTube channel came into play. It was basically something where I could set up here on my own, work on machines I bought with my own money, do all my projects on my own time, and on my YouTube channel I could teach exactly what I wanted to teach. I could make more specific welding demonstrations or do some crazy art projects where I could basically show people what's possible. So working on this truck rack here so far, everything is fitting together very well. Now getting comfortable to weld this thing out is definitely a challenge. As you can see, there's tons of angles where I kind of have to position myself a little bit funny. I'm using clamps here and there to use as hand steadies. These things will get my hands off a hot surface and help me out a little bit. Working with these diamond copes, these are definitely making for some really fun welding passes. Focusing on my lines as I'm going around a tube, I found this gives each joint some awesome looking flow. And putting all my starts and finishes in the same places, we can add a lot of symmetry and organization as well. Everybody knows I am a freak for the small details. Okay, so as I'm working my way through the welding phase of this project, I'm taking a moment every now and then to stop, drop it on my table, and check check and see how flat it is. Now I know my table's not perfectly flat, but it's gonna give me a good idea of how much things are moving while I'm welding it. Okay, I've also cut up some aluminum plate here. I put a little bend on it to match the angle of the truck rack itself. It's time to tack these in place and weld them to the rack. Now on my channel, I did an episode about a month or so ago. I was basically reaching a breaking point during this episode. Between balancing my online business with what I'm doing here, as well as my YouTube channel and my online TIG welding programs I'm running, not to mention my full-time job and being a husband and a father to 2 kids. At this point, I was really feeling the stress of all these things. There was a long period of time I tried to make the balance between all these different categories, but this last winter was a really difficult one for me. I lost a really close family member. That one hurt a lot. I lost both my dogs within a matter of months to one another. And to be honest, this winter, things really set in very heavily on me. I've never really dealt with a struggle like this before in my life. And when I started to notice that the stress was really starting to cause me to lose patience with a lot of things that, to be honest, really didn't matter, I had to make a decision. Things had to change. So it was time to put all my chips on the table, and it was time to go full-time with my business here. Now this is where we're taking the 2 stories that we're talking about here and they collide. So you know that friend I was talking about needed a rack for that truck to get going? That friend is actually me. Aha, plot twist. So I've got a ton of ideas of what I want to be doing in my shop here. There's a ton of videos that I want to be making for this channel full time. New art pieces that I've been working on for over a year now, as well as making stuff like you're seeing me work on in today's episode here. I want to mix it up and make the best stuff possible, both in my shop and for you watching on YouTube. I'm going to be taking on jobs like this more often, and as well as other jobs I essentially have time to work on at this point, because I always want to stay relevant and up to date with my skills in welding as well as fabrication. So again, that's my main goal for building stuff like this. However, with a rack on my truck now, I now have the ability to rip down the street, grab whatever lengths of material I need at the shop down there, so I can get a job done quickly for somebody without much hassle. Plus, there's also a really rad welding store right there, as well as a brewery right next to it. A pretty perfect setup, right? So having a rack on my truck, as well as access to materials and supplies, as well as a killer setup at my studio and shop here, I'm gonna be able to do the best stuff possible. I wanna get everything set up my way. Okay, another thing that I've done as a finishing touch is I've made these top caps that will go on top of the rack. These are cut on a little bit of an angle. I think they look pretty cool. And I made caps that will fit on the top. I'm gonna tack and TIG weld these in place. TIG welding these top caps in place was definitely precarious. It's tough to balance these in place while you're trying to tack them at the same time, and then trying to fully weld them is very difficult. It's hard to stay comfortable while you're welding them. Some of these welds up top are gonna be super visible. So I wanna make sure when I'm welding them, I do the best job I can, because obviously if they don't look that good, it's gonna drive me crazy. After TIG welding these in place, I'm probably gonna end up doing some finishing grinding to remove some of the weld here and there, make the surfaces blend together. I think it's gonna look pretty cool. So welding this thing and finishing it, it turned out awesome. I'm super stoked. I ripped it down to a local shop and I got a powder coated black. This is gonna make the finish much more durable over time. I also got some decals made to put on the side for my business name. A lot of people know that logo now. This is the start to something really incredible for me. I'm also in the process of upgrading my shop. Not only did I take the time to build this project for myself, as well as putting up my own money to make this thing essentially without getting anything in return for it, I also bought a brand new bandsaw. I bought a brand new belt sander, as well as a bunch of tools. I'm also planning on getting a really sick welding table in here pretty quick. I'm going all in on what I'm doing here myself. I have nothing but love and respect for the shop that I left. Those people, even after leaving, are still family to me. I just reached a point where I needed to grow more, both as a welder, as a teacher, and as somebody who could basically be the best version of themselves for my family. What I'm doing is scary as hell. I have never been the type of person to ever think I would do anything like this, but I'm going for it. I hope that what I'm doing building this here today, as well as the story that I'm telling, inspires somebody. You do not have to quit your job. You do not have to make any extreme crazy changes. But if there's something in your mind you feel compelled you have to chase, you have to do it. Life is too short. Recently losing some really close people around me, as well as feeling what stress can really do to your health. Take care of yourself. Chase down or even just do something that makes you happy. To everybody who's been following what I'm doing on my YouTube channel all this time, thank you so much. To anybody who's new to what I'm doing here, be sure to follow along. I never ask people to subscribe or whatever, but that's a great way to follow along with what I'm doing here on my channel. I hope this inspires you. I hope everything is going well wherever you are. Thank you so much for watching. All the best to you.